Hi, so my name is Chelsea Haith. I'm a DPhil student at the University of Oxford and a regular contributor to Writers Make Worlds. And with me is Kayo Chingonyi, Assistant Professor at Durham University in Creative Writing and Poetry in the English faculty there. Hi, Kayo, how are you doing?
Hi, how are you? I'm good, thank you, Chelsea. Lovely to be able to speak.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm all right. I've been calling this the season of caveats, and with all the usual caveats, I'm good.
Yeah, likewise. Um, so things are difficult in the world, but some excellent news for you recently with your nomination to Best Collection for the Forward Prize recently for your second collection, A Blood Condition, the follow-up to Kumukanda. How did that nomination make you feel?
I think in reflecting on the Forward Prize, one of the things that's come to my mind quite strongly is that one of it's not one of the prizes that I thought I would ever be in contention for, because I guess there's early career prizes like the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, or the Dylan Thomas Prize, which I won for Kumukanda. Um, there's a kind of there's an age limit and a kind of feeling of being at the beginning of something in relation to those prizes, and I think this early in my career, even though I've been, I guess, doing readings and things in poetry for a long time, this early in terms of my publishing, to to be in that category with people who've been practicing for decades is really staggering to me. Most especially with someone like, well, just yeah, to be in the same category as Selima Hill, for example, whose work is so consistent across a broad span of practice, and who maintains a connection to live creativity within poetry and extending one's repertoire. Um, yeah, it's gratifying. It's gratifying at one level to feel, yeah, to feel that I'm kind of in that company. But it's also, I think, it's very sobering to be shortlisted for these things. It makes you realize a lot of things about your work and about work generally in creativity, which is that it's a very subjective business to judge these things. And I take it for the kind of for I take it for the praise that it is, and I accept it in that spirit. But I try not to get swerved too far off my trajectory by being shortlisted for prizes, or indeed not shortlisted for prizes, as is more often the case. Um, it's not something that I write for, but it is wonderful and gratifying and emboldening in its way, and so I'm grateful. But it's not my aim, and certainly wasn't my aim in writing this book. So yeah, it's yeah, a surprising and welcome bonus, I suppose, is how I'd think about it.
Yeah, I really like that idea that it's, I mean, I suppose people don't write to win prizes, right? They write to, to communicate something or, because they have to. Do you want to articulate a little bit more about what you meant about an aim, what your aim is when you're writing, when you wrote A Blood Condition? And is that different to the aim that you've maybe perceived for Kumukanda?
I think the aim in writing this work, the book is called A Blood Condition, to gesture in triplicate, really, to HIV and also family inheritance and also, I suppose, one's individual place in the world. So I guess heredity is a blood condition, just as HIV is a blood condition, just as a range of things could be considered blood conditions in that sense. Just as, you know, the human condition is one that connects very closely to the idea of blood and life force and that kind of thing. So it's it's in part a set of elegies, and it's also in part a celebration of life as well, which I'm increasingly drawn to elegies that celebrate life in that way and are less to do with lament and more to do with capturing a moment of vitality, I suppose. So my aim in this book was to access more directly some of the points of grief that I've experienced, bereavements and so forth, but also to dynamically engage with them such that there was a possibility for vitality.
Yeah, you certainly get that feeling kind of moving between poems such as the 16, let me now find it, 16 bars
16
for the bits.
bars for the bits.
Yeah, I love it. And having heard you speak before, I can just hear it and hear that there's music, there must be music in your life that is for this piece. And then that following on from origin myth and of course Nyami Nyami. Yeah, that sense of a vital human roar is something that I've always found in your work, and obviously again such a pleasure to see it here. So that vitality is certainly coming off the page.
Thank you. I'm really glad that that's connecting in that way. Yeah, so I think if there was an aim, it was just to treat some of these subjects that are explored in Kumukanda with a more direct perspective somehow, but to maintain an essential opacity. I'm going to gesture towards glissant for a moment. I don't think you can read the book and necessarily pass a stable narrative from it, and that's important to me in poetry. But I think there are direct moments of engagement with feeling, which are, I think, an important part of what I was trying to do in this book relative to things I've published in the past.
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about the meaning of Kumukanda, the context of initiation, and the covers, the two covers of the book. So the first one, of course, there's a kind of a figure looking out, sort of beyond the reader, but looking out of the page, and then this, of course, is the back of a man's or a person's head. And I wondered a little bit about that, if there's an intentional artistic choice there, the opacity, of course, of not being able to see a speaker's face, and the kind of potential movement towards and away from a reader, signaled both by the covers and by the content.
I think that's a really astute observation. The cover for my first book, Kumukanda, I really loved the cover, but my original intention with the cover for that book was to have something sort of inward looking and dark, by the same artist. It's an image from Lynette Yerdemboachi called A Radical Under Beechwood. I love that I was persuaded towards this cover, which is much more, I think there's a sense in which the figure in that image is meeting the spectator and creating a complicity or relationship between the subject and the spectator, which I think is really powerful. There's a kind of playful indignation as well in it. Whereas the image I was originally thinking about was a very inward-looking image with dark hues, and the image for the second collection is a kind of gesture towards that. I love the work of Toyonoji Odutola, and this image seemed to really reflect the ways in which I was trying to leave behind certain things and to also let go the dead. Yeah, and it's this figure in a blue fur jacket, engaged in their own kind of individual process and facing away from the viewer. Yeah, and I suppose there's a will to opacity there, but there's also letting go, allowing that figure to remain mysterious and to also proceed along their own path. So yeah, I think it's important to me to make those gestures in the first moment that a potential reader of the book will connect with the book, which is often the cover. And for me, the cover is the unit of poetic sense, along with the title. And so, yeah, it was important at that stage to be making certain extra textual gestures.
I think it's something that's so special about poetry collections that, you know, the author is so much more involved in the materiality of the product than in, for example, prose. And it's really, I mean, it's obviously really fascinating to hear about, you know, the potential differences, how else it could have gone, essentially. So I kind of want to move from the form of the existing book to the form of the text, to think a little bit about the traces of the lyricist, as I think was mentioned in your Forward Prize interview. Of course, you know, 16 bars for the bits is lyrical, and thinking a bit about the kind of movement between prose poetry, work that rhymes. You know, the origin myth sections are like stanzas. Are you drawn to particular forms for particular content?
I think the form suggests itself more often than not in the first few lines that materialize in my imagination or notebook or wherever it is that the poem starts. There's already inscribed some sense of what the form might be. And the early process of poetic composition for me is to find out what form this particular poetic text I'm engaged in at that moment, what form it's going to take. And that's part of how I find out when the piece is finished, is that it's arrived at a form that feels fruitful and generative to the ideas in the piece. In terms of, yeah, I'm drawn to full rhyme because I'm a lyricist. I write songs. I'm coming at poetry from the prism of rap, which is one of my first kind of poetic apprenticeships, was to write rap lyrics and also freestyle regularly. And so there's a sense in which full rhymes are a part of my literary imagination. But I wanted to think about also, I wanted to think about free verse prosody as well, which I'm exploring in a number of these poems. And indeed, free verse prosody was one of my principal modes for the longest time. And so I think in this book, one of the things I'm doing is just drawing from a broad range of poetics that have been influential on my kind of poetic voice or voices. And yes, I am increasingly led by each kind of text into the direction that it intimates that it wishes to go.
I certainly seem to find the poems that are joyful, or maybe vital is more accurate, are the ones in which there seems to be kind of internal rhyme, there's rhythm in the piece, whereas the pieces particularly about your mother tend to be less so, or less sort of rhyming, and are more kind of free verse, prose.
Yeah, there's a kind of axis, and I think the perfect balance is always something I'm striving for in terms of how much rhyme and meter are a driving force in the poem. And sometimes when you're broaching a particular subject, it's important just to be with the concepts and not necessarily be with the kind of engineering of their evocation. And so I don't get as lost in rhythm and rhyme in those kinds of poems. But I guess rhythm and rhyme in some way is inflected throughout my work one way or another. There's an awful lot of internal rhyming. And I suppose some of it depends upon the accent in which the reader of the poem speaks, and therefore what's available to their auditory imagination. And it's enjoyable to me that some people might find rhymes here that other people wouldn't find, for example. And that kind of thing is, I think, an improvisational thread that I'm keen for readers to explore.
I really like that. I mean, it's the age-old kind of the reader is the co-creator of the text discussion. But what I wonder about then is, do you have certain poems that are written with certain readers, either internal or external, in mind?
Not explicitly, unless those poems are addressed to a particular person, whether explicitly addressed or in a more opaque fashion. No, I think my ideal reader is really just whoever is, willing to spend time with these words and, to populate them with association and to try and follow the associations they suggest. I think that's my ideal reader, someone who's willing to give the work that time and energy. Beyond that, I don't often write with a particular person in mind, no. With a few exceptions where I write a love poem, for example, to my partner, or something that's a kind of elegy or remembrance for a friend, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think it's I think whichever way, and for whomever you write, right, there is no right or wrong answer. Yeah. I wanted to think a little bit about kind of moving from what we talk about when we talk about the ideal reader to kind of images that are evoked and the kind of context that they bring to it. And so, as I've mentioned to you before, my father and that part of his family lived in Zambia for a long time, and so reading these poems is very different, obviously, for me than it would be for people who currently live in Zambia. And I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of thematic content, the concepts of the nation, history, body, and then water, and the blood as a liquid, thinking about a body of water, water as a body, but also a liquid, somewhat tautologically there, and how these sort of flow through the poems, and how those concepts are linked for you, because the whole piece is the whole. I mean, obviously it's a collection, but it also functions as a whole. And to begin with, the Great Zambezi River seems quite symbolic in terms of transnational movement, the shift from the beginning in Zambia to Leeds and London towards the end. If you want to speak a little bit about that, kind of the connections there of nation, water, and bodies.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of central metaphors that occupies my imagination is this idea of a body of water or a body of work, or that kind of connection to the body. I think is something I think about a lot, because lots of my connection to poetry begins with performance and inside the body. And so I guess there's a sense in which when I'm writing, the body is implied frequently. And there are moments when I want to increase the sense of tactility of the body, or the sense of connection to the body in the poems. And I think this was a collection in which I wanted to do that, because of the bodily vulnerability of a virus, but also the vulnerability of reckoning with certain aspects of one's own particular life history. And in particular, my life history is colored by HIV and personal and national grief. And I think one of the things I was thinking about in calling the book A Blood Condition is continuity. And water is a wonderful substance for exploring continuity and force and devastation and grace. It's a wonderfully mutable substance. And, one of the poems is called Water Can Flow and Water Can Crash, which is a quotation from Bruce Lee about the kind of shape-shifting capability of water and its particles. So, yeah, I think one of the reasons I was drawn to water was this kind of this capacity for change and transformation that it has. And it feels like an apposite symbol, therefore, of the kind of change, transformation, and healing, embodied and otherwise, that the book represents. In the absence of healing from a particular virus, what are the possibilities of healing from the after effects of the virus, for example, which is to say personal and national grief? What are the possibilities of writing into healing in the form of acceptance, of one's HIV status, which I guess in one of the poems I reference a negative HIV status and how that might interplay with feelings of guilt, both personal and national, having witnessed so much loss as a consequence of that particular virus. So, yeah, I feel like water was a way of, and a very tried and tested way of exploring some of those themes. There's a reason, I think, why we're drawn back to it as human beings. And far be it from me to depart wholly from the script.
Yeah. Did it feel odd to have this collection which deals so much with water and loss and grief and a deadly kind of unbeatable virus come out just before a major pandemic.
I think
During a major pandemic, which is
one of the things, I guess I conceived of this book quite a long time ago in 2017, when the first poems that formed the manuscript started to arrive. I think for a lot of people, there's a kind of fortunate position they occupy, which is that COVID-19 is their first pandemic. And I think that's an enormously fortunate position globally. And also, I don't wish to take away anything from anyone who hasn't experienced kind of mass health-based calamity before, in terms of a kind of national or international virus or pandemic. But I guess one of the things I was thinking about is how HIV, especially in the West, has a particular script. And for those of us who are from places like Zambia, that script is much more complex than is currently afforded by the stories that are told about HIV. And I wanted to augment those stories and add to those stories and be in solidarity and kinship with those stories in writing this book. So I wanted for those stories not to be thought of as stories from the past in one sense. And so I wanted people to connect with the ways in which HIV has affected people in the West. But also I wanted people to connect with how it continues to affect people in the global South in ways that are not spoken about frequently and are not, I think, legible. I don't think the prevalence of HIV around the world still is fully understood in the West. And so part of my writing this book was to kind of just complicate things a little bit. And, you know, with it coming out in the midst of a pandemic is kind of one of those oddments of happenstance that the universe or something throws to us from time to time. But I think what it really points to is that pandemics and health crises of this magnitude are not by any stretch a new phenomena for human beings, but they're a phenomena that in the West we've begun to distance ourselves from because they affect us less frequently. And indeed when they, say again?
And less severely when they do affect us.
Yes, indeed. And so that's been a kind of point of reckoning as well. When vaccines started to emerge, who were the vaccines overwhelmingly given to, and to whom were the vaccines readily accessible and to whom were they not? And, the story of HIV is connected to COVID-19 in relation to some of these thoughts. Only through the accelerated program of developing a COVID-19 vaccine has there been a renewed impetus to create vaccines for other viruses which aren't as prevalent in the West. And, I think the silent question that underpins the collection, A Blood Condition, is what are the impulses behind those kind of systems of mass concern or legibility or or what renders a particular virus legitimate in the West, I suppose. A legitimate and newsworthy, I suppose, is a word I could use. A newsworthy thing. So yeah, that's part of what I was thinking about. And yeah, to those who've been kind of exploring the consequences of late capitalism and systems of governance that have been with us for a long time, pandemics like this are totally unsurprising. And to those of us who've sat with the legacy of HIV, also pandemics like this are totally unsurprising in the ways that certain people have been kind of disenfranchised by government policy and shown to be non-essential. Those were the terms that were that were put forward. Yeah, I think it's been very stark, and I hope people make those connections from reading the book, because yeah, those problems have been problems of humanity for a long time, and they haven't emerged from COVID-19 alone.
Yeah, there's a lot of mention of capital and a lot of criticism of capital in the book as well, or in the collection as well. And I am perhaps remiss in neglecting to mention that in the kind of conversation about water, because obviously money is a thing that flows, and it flowed, out of the Zambian copper belt for a period of time, and it is so determinant of resilience, of a nation's resilience against something as disastrous as a pandemic. Yeah, so there's definitely a sense there of that kind of those symbols being more than just relevant to blood, but also to movements of power.
Yeah, I think that's one of the central tensions in the book as well, is the kind of flow of capital. Yeah, it's an important thread and theme that I'm concerned with. And yeah, I think in thinking about Zambia's post-independence legacy, I cannot avoid thinking about these things, and so it makes sense that they make up such a strong part of the book.
So I want to ask a little bit now a bit more about form and how you put a collection together. And you use a lovely phrase about that when the poems start arriving. When does one collection of poems stop arriving, or when do you feel like these are the poems that work for a collection, or when do you kind of go through a notebook and find the ones that will work for something? How does that kind of process of turning the contents of your imagination and the things that are arriving into this?
I think for a lot of people it's a mysterious process. The Ulster poet Michael Longley famously said, if I knew where poems came from, I'd go there. Words to that effect. I think one of the things that happens is that there's a kind of critical mass in my brain around a particular subject or preoccupation, or things keep recurring somehow. And that's when I realized that this is something that isn't just one poem, but is maybe a group of poems, and it's something I'm going to return to several times. But there's a crucial sense for me in which the book comes about from being given a title. And so Kumukanda was the title that emerged before the manuscript was complete, and A Blood Condition also emerged comparatively early in the process. And once I have that title, then I know what kind of thing I'm working towards. And One of my favorite kind of theorists of versification is Mimi Khalvati, whose classes in poetry I've variously taken at different times. But one of the things Mimi says is that poetic practice is a practice of finding the appropriate net with which to catch the particular fish that each poem is. And I think one of the things I realize about what happens between books is that I start fishing in different bodies of water, basically. And so I start catching different fish. And the form arises out of the need to accommodate the size or the scope or the slipperiness of those fish, basically. And as I say, the form comes across quite quickly in the process of composition for me. And so I work out what it is I'm working towards, and then I improvise to that point until it's as fixed as I'm willing for it to be. And then I stop at that moment, and I edit, but I don't go back and change too much. Well, I do actually, but that's the primary process, and then another process is to edit and augment what is there. And either cast it aside as something that needs further development or exploration, or then take it further. Very occasionally something shows itself almost complete in one instance and gives me a very direct sense that it belongs to another body of work. And that happened not so long ago with a long poem, which I think will be a kind of long form poem eventually. I tried to put it in the manuscript for this book, but it wanted to be a long form work, existing on its own terms and not in relation to other pieces. And so I have to follow that impulse.
Oh, what a pleasure to know that impulse is right, and to be at a place in your writing career, in your poetry career, and in, I suppose, to have the sense of what the work requires and what the poems require of you, to be able to do that.
I mean, it's not always the case that I'm right about these things, but I can have a strong impression, and I think that is frequently enough to go on.
Yeah, trust your gut, right? It's that old thing. I think to wrap up, I as discussed, would love to hear Chingola Road Cemetery from you, and then if you have any comments on that and the composition of that poem.
As a way of seamlessly finding the poem in the manuscript, I'm going to tell you about its composition first.
Great.
And the seamlessness of that is such that I need to tell you about that particular fracture. When you first bring out a book, you don't know where anything in it is, or at least I don't. I'm starting to learn. But Chingola Road Cemetery is the cemetery where my dad and various of my uncles and also my cousin is buried. And many of those people have been lost to complications of HIV. So it's a place that's very freighted for me with association. And this poem is a kind of associative riff on that place, and it's kind of symbolic. Weight in my life. I went there most recently in 2017, and we tried to find my dad's grave, but could not, because it's not clearly demarcated, and there's various places that are overgrown, and it's been a long, long time since my dad died. So Chingola Road Cemetery explores all of those tensions. Because of what it would take to visit Chingola Road Cemetery. Because of what it would take to visit, I visit Tata's grave on Street View in the early hours of mornings when the edge of sleep is like the border at Kasumbalesa, where men with red eyes police their sovereign patch, Kalashnikovs at their sides, gold standard of summary justice, making of a family cartographers, then sextons. Our Year 9 biology teacher glossed succession. The built environment will always be exposed as a fad, given time. And so it has come to pass here, the Chingonyi name's resting place. This is a picture of David, late, and Muzanga, equally late, and John Kanjamba, also late. Where we might find a stone, it's overgrown with long grasses and plants designated weeds because we've yet to lend them use. I came to pay my respects, as did my mother before me, kneeling at the exact spot all she carried like a bag of shopping dropped, its contents rolling. On the tape she made of his favorite songs, her voice cracks in the act of speaking as if the act is what loosed him from this plane. Let us pause to play him Hotel California. Let us say father and son are driving together along a coastal road in an open-top feat of mid-century automotive nous. The son rides shotgun, skipping tunes to test the low end of the Altec Lansing system in the back. As one track fades, another picks up the slack. A wayfarer's tune, written in a shack on a 4-track in the 70s. Guitar, a voice threaded with regret. Each word a promise that, in the end, the singer could not keep.